Okay.
You got 15 minutes you could say about that volume?
Or 3.
15 more minutes?
15 more minutes.
It's a general,
Just a general
overview of it.
overview.
What is it you claim? What's your thesis? And what are the major ways that you defend it?
Okay, well, I have the exact wording of it. Let's see, that I use. So, the exact claim is that, that I'm demonstrating that to be human is to have a self composed of words and deeds that are founded on an emotional appreciation of reality, which includes notions of what reality really is like, an existential sense of what it means to be human, either abstractly or as part of one specific culture or religion, and a sense of how human beings relate to one another as part of a social system that includes morality. And so, in an effort to demonstrate that claim, I look to research from recent neurosciences to discover what the neurosciences have to say about how human brains work and how human brains go about the task of forming a self. And then I look at evidence from the social sciences and from philosophy and theology to see how people who study religion have usually understood those three concepts, an emotional relationship to reality, an existential sense of self, and the need for social cohesion. And I argue using on sort of 2 prongs. One, that the natural sciences in the form of recent neuroscience demonstrate that human beings have needs for certain cultural materials with which to form a self, so that the brain has to require something external to it in order to have an activity that produces a self. And that's the second line of proof then that in the study of the history of religions, these 3 particular kinds of cultural material that I identify, emotional, existential, and social, have been argued to be foundational for religion, and that one can see in the parallels between how the neuroscientists talk about the need for cultural materials, specific needs for those cultural materials, and thus the universality, or at least an apparent universality of religion addressing itself to those 3 issues, along with other things, of course. But the argument being that religion has historically provided this material, not necessarily with the intention of providing it for the sake of forming selves, but implicitly because the brain needs this sort of cultural material, and so cultural practices arise that provide that material. That would be the core of it.
And then?
Okay, I think so.
Okay, I guess I get to go first, Richard. So,
Okay.
Relax, okay? I think that my part of this is, as you know, the neuroscience part, and I think that you leave the neuroscience rather quickly in your thesis, and so there's not a whole lot for me to address in terms of my expertise, but I will take a stab at taking a stab at you. So here's my thinking, and I'd just like you to speak to this, is that a lot of the neuroscience that you use has to do with connecting emotions to the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And since that is in the neuroscience literature at this point in our study very speculative, for example, use the amygdala and the limbic system, which certainly have to do with fear emotions, but maybe more of a component of a larger system, and certainly non-encapsulated fear in the brain. Everything projects to the frontal lobes. One could easily make the argument that the frontal lobes are really the seat of emotion rather than the amygdala and the limbic system, depending on where you make the cut. So seeing that the neuroscience is rather speculative at this point in terms of the connection between brain and emotion, I'd be interested in hearing how that affects your thesis, being speculative itself, in a way, about how you think the self, especially the brain, needing certain information to be nourished and to be able to create itself. So,
Yeah.
look, you want me to
No.
sum up, or you okay?
Yeah, well, I think that admittedly, the neuroscientists that I'm relying on are speculating on their research. So they're not claiming that they've proven these things. They're claiming that they see indications that these things are true. So in particular, you know, in the way that you put the question, asking about complex systems, I think that that we see that especially in the way Antonio Damasio talks about the relationship between primary emotions and secondary emotions, and he seems to argue specifically along the lines that you're going, that it is in the complexity of the system, which must include the frontal lobes, in the development of what he calls those secondary emotions. So,
But we take a step from that immediately away
Yeah.
from hard organ neuroscience. You know, when Damasio was saying that, he's starting, like you said, it's anecdotal.
yeah,
He's starting with this notion of what the brain systems do, and then taking this next step that's, you know, hardly proven, hardly even supported. I mean, it's logical, and it makes a lot, just like Ramachandran's arguments. They're logical next steps.
Right.
But we have no idea where it's going to go. I mean, it can go very differently. We could find out some different information, different brain systems easily. I mean,
well, and I think I explicitly acknowledge that there are inherent limits when one is speculating on the basis of the sciences. And so, and I think in a couple of different places I even say that it's quite possible that there will be new information that can demonstrate that there's something fundamentally wrong or completely wrong about the account that I've been giving. But at another level, I think, though, that there's something that's more significant generally to my argument that doesn't necessarily rely on the specifics of Ramachandran's analysis of how the limbic system is coloring experience, or Damasio's claims about the relationship between primary emotions and secondary emotions. But, well, although maybe I'm speaking too quickly by dismissing Ramachandran, because I think the core claim that I need to demonstrate when I'm demonstrating has to do with the fact that the brain is an emotional organ as much as it is a rational organ. And so that argument, I think, is important in the history of philosophy, because philosophy has historically downplayed the role of emotions. And
psychology too, neuroscience too.
well, because that's the soft part.
Mhm.
How do the neurosciences get a hold of it? But in philosophy, it's that we start with Aristotle and Plato asking what's different about human beings, and their answer is human beings have reason. And so that's been the trajectory that philosophy takes. And I'm by no means the first person to say that we need to take the role of emotions more seriously. And I talk about some important philosophers, in particular like Schleiermacher in the late 1700s, and what he was doing with the role of feelings and emotions. So there's certainly a counter trend in the history for philosophy to examine the role of emotions. But I think that given what the neurosciences have said to date, that gives philosophy something concrete to speculate on. And to the degree that people like Ramachandran and Damasio are informed in very specific empirical research and are making reasonable speculations, that those reasonable speculations provide grounds for philosophy to do some work.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that we can leave the neuroscience towards speculation fairly quickly, as long as we give it its due. Am I hearing that correctly?
Right, at least that I'm not.
You're not
But
trying to say.
I'm making a more general claim,
Okay.
so I don't think because the claim is general and about the implications of this research, that I think I'm justified then in sort of using it to set a groundwork for my speculation, but not having to rely on it as formal evidence, but as groundwork.
Just as a footnote, you should try the existentialists, since that's their specific own, that what we need to do is to examine the emotions, and that this is what we need to do in order to understand human beings.
That's a good point, and I probably, there would be room, especially for Sartre's work on emotions.
I've just been doing
Yeah.
Sartre in the class.
Yeah. So, which is part of that counter tendency in philosophy to, it's there, in spite of that dominant string where philosophy likes to talk about reason.
We're just opening it up, and then can get back to many other issues if we want to.
One of my questions actually follows up nicely on John's, and it's a very, very similar question, but more generally, I guess I'd like a more general response. What, you know that your work is speculation. There's several times you even end the work by saying, this is a speculation. But you also use a word like demonstration. And I just wonder in what sense, what do you see the relationship between speculation and demonstration? Part of your work is speculation, but you seem to want to claim that the whole of the work is demonstrating something. So what is that? What is that relationship between speculation and demonstration?
Well, I definitely want to claim that I am demonstrating that core claim that human beings need this cultural material, and that we can, broadly speaking, pick out this material in 3 categories. So I think the speculation is more about what to do with it. So if making that claim, which in some ways I think is a fairly modest claim, given the history of what's happened in philosophy of mind and the kinds of things that Dennett in particular is sort of the minimal claims that Dennett, I think, reasonably demonstrates. So there is this core claim that I want to say, yes, I'm proving this core claim. But I think what's interesting is the part that's the speculative part.
Okay,
what do we do with that information?
And the core claim is that that the brain is an emotional.
That the brain, by virtue of being emotional, requires cultural material.
Okay, so the core claim is that by virtue of being an emotional organ, the brain requires cultural material, right?
Right.
Okay. Now, you also have a section in the introduction about, you admit a kind of logical problem, at least in part of what's going on in the discussion. And you argue that that there's a circularity, but that you don't think that your argument is itself circular.
But the explanation relies on a
Okay.
circularity of concepts, but the argument itself does not.
Right, and you admit that the circularity is that that in talking about the brain in the way that you do, it leaves you with phrases like the brain talking about the brain.
Yeah.
And I would add to a phrase like the brain interacts with the world. And we've had lots of discussions about this, and you know, I think you've created a kind of pseudo problem that confuses the concept of the brain with the concept of the person or the self. So let me state that position, and then let me allow you to respond.
Okay.
My position is that a brain is only part of what it means to be a person, while the person or self is a concept that indicates the whole of a human individual, and that your position, you say, requires you to accept that the brain is kind of the ultimate source in such a way that the brain really ultimately is the self. Is that correct?
Well, or at least as the self generally is reducible to the activity of the
Okay.
brain.
All right. If you accept this, then if you accept my position, which is that the brain is simply a part of what it means to be a self, a human being, then I don't, my position doesn't run into that logical problem. And so I suppose I want you to respond yet again, but in this format, to this problem of what looks like a circularity to me. That is that brains talk, well, there's several problems. Brains talking about brains, but primarily the concept of the relation between the concept of the brain and the concept of the self, the concept of the person. What do you see that relationship to be?
Well, I see the self as an abstraction that we talk about, that has a phenomenological quality that we experience, but that there isn't a self per se that exists. There are brains that exist and interact with a larger world and interact with an internal world and interact with other brains. And in those interactions, there is the physical person has activities in the world guided by the activity of the brain. But the rest of it are linguistic abstractions that we use to express ideas that we have about this activity or ideas that we have about the experience, but that they don't have their own ontological status.
Do these ideas, these abstracted ideas about the self, do they not guide us? I mean, you seem to, when you spoke of the brain guiding us, it sounded like you were implying that the idea of the self does not guide us in the way that the brain guides us, or that it couldn't because the self doesn't have ontological status.
I would argue that it couldn't.
Yeah.
That we have that somehow, curiously enough, in a way that I can't explain, and from what I understand, the neuroscientists and the people who do philosophy of mind who really talk about this thing, they can't explain either, but we do have this experience of a self, and that this experience of a self that has intentions and acts in the world, but that when one looks at the operations of what's happening, inside the little black box, it's not at all clear where those things come from or why they're there. But we can say that it doesn't appear that the brain itself has a central locus or focal point of control, and so the activity is an amalgam of different component pieces all interacting together. Like in Margaret Bowden's example in the classroom full of children, that there's no one who's really in charge, but somehow through all of the chattering, there is a consensus that forms that is then the experience of the self with intention.
Well, this is difficult for me to grasp because it sounds as if you do use the concept of the self as if it has some kind of ontological status of some sort, or by that I mean as if it's real. Because you speak, I mean, your very first claim is that you're going to demonstrate that to be human is to have a self, composed of words and all the rest. And so it's very difficult for me to grasp the notion that a self is not real, and yet you're going to talk about it as if it is real. And I guess, I mean, on my view, of course, that would mean that the fact if you talk about something as if it is real, then and people take it that way, then in fact it is real. So I suppose the question then is, what does it mean? What are these distinctions? I mean, I'll give you just a quick example. You in a very a beautiful acknowledgement of your time in Utah with your grandmother, Eleanor. And you say she has a place in this work. I guess my question is, who is that? I mean, who has, in the present tense, has a place in this work? I mean, it sounds like you're saying this person is in this, and I see that makes perfect sense to me. But what I can't understand is how it makes sense to you to say something like that.
To speak of a self as having a phenomenological reality while denying that it has an ontological reality.
Yeah, that may be one way of putting it.
Well, and I think that's the way that I understand it, is that for me the phenomenon doesn't necessitate an ontological reality, even though the phenomenon is sort of ubiquitous in being human, and we have those experiences of our individual self, and we have those experiences of other selves as they exist across time and as they've influenced us in the past, and how that influence lingers. But so there's at some point, I just don't see that as a problem, to talk about a phenomenon of something that has these appearances, but yet we can acknowledge that it doesn't have a proper ontological status, and that if we want to talk about what's really going on, we have to talk about something other than the phenomenon, but that the phenomenon is still useful and interesting and contributes to the complexity and wonder that is human life.
Well, I mean, it sounds to me as if you want to reserve the right to say everything that you can possibly say about a phenomenon, except that you want to deny that it's real. And I mean that just seems very strange to me, because it sounds to me as if you don't want to, the fact that it is not real, from your view, doesn't seem to undermine it in any way in terms of its importance, its value, its role in our lives. And that's why I wondered about your use of the word guidance there, because certainly I think it would be accurate to say that that your own background and the people in your background, there's a sense in which that has guided your work, and that seems like that's what you're trying to express. And so, my question is, it's just difficult for me to accept that as a notion of reality, as a concept that those things are not really real. So,
well, but people do things, and people do say things, and so the words and deeds, as Dennett talks about it, the words and deeds spinning the self, while the self may be a phenomenological abstraction that doesn't have proper ontological status in the way, in my view, and I think in his view as well, the things that make up that phenomenon, those things are real. So I think I would use an analogy like color, that when we talk about red, the red is a phenomenon, and the phenomenon doesn't have a proper ontological status qua red. The frequency of light that's absorbed by a given surface, and the way in which light waves are perceived by rods and cones and processed in the brain, all of that has, to my mind, proper ontological status. But the red itself doesn't, even though red has a place in our lives, in the phenomenon of the lives of ourselves and our cultures and such.
Yeah, and it just seems to me that that yours is an attempt to usurp the concept of reality, for your materialistic. I mean, that puts you in good company. Lots of philosophers do that, but it seems that, in a way that doesn't do justice to the fact that what's really real for people in this room is not the light refractions, but the fact that that's a red piece of paper, that's what's really real, the red paper itself. And so, you know, I mean, it's just we're not gonna be able to settle this today, of course, but it has to do with, you know, what one takes to be reality and the concept of reality.
Right, well, it has deep metaphysical implications, to be sure, because I'm agreeing with you completely that the red, or that the phenomenological experience of the self has this phenomenal reality that is important and unavoidable. So the disagreement is, I think, is how we're talking about what is the ontological reality or the metaphysical reality that undergirds the phenomenal reality.
That's right, and I guess, yeah, I think that's correct, and I would just add that my position is that, given all those distinctions, I still want to reserve, I would still like to protect the right of any individual to walk in and to say, the red is real.
Okay.
All right. On that
So,
conference note.
yeah, my time is
I'm
up.
going to add a PS, that I'm more interested in your grandmother.
Okay.
And it seems to me something that's real to you, and that you have to give it that kind of status. It's not a piece of red paper. It's a person who affected you, and whom you admit to having been important to you. And that must have some kind of ontological status.
Well, and I think that's the point I was making about her words and deeds
Yeah.
are properly real in the account that I'm giving. The idea that of her as a self, I'm saying that I can't account I can't metaphysically account for that self existing apart from this collection of words and deeds. But the words and deeds still have influence in my words and deeds going forward.
But I'll bet you a buck when your grandmother was affecting you, you never thought to yourself, now is she really a person?
Well, no, of course not, because I can see the importance that Pat's trying to claim in the way people talk about things, while at the same time wanting to assert that I think that there's a deeper philosophy in which we can talk about these things with more precision. But it's true in our experience that we use this word, the word of the reality of self or the reality of color, more loosely because the phenomenon has an impact. But there's also related to, in particular to the relationship point. There's a point that that Dan Siegel makes about how the brain is a relational organ, and that part of this formation of other with the experience of other self, so that the phenomenon of oneself is created in part in the interaction with the phenomenon of another. So, I can see Pat's point that there's a way in which talking about these things has a feeling of undermining them, but I want to insist that the phenomenon and that we call the self, this abstraction of the self, as Dennett talks about, that questioning its ontological status or putting it in a different sort of ontological box for the purposes of metaphysical speculation doesn't diminish the experience. It may help us analyze the experience in more complex ways in the future.
It diminishes its status if it's not considered ontologically real. I wish we had your grandmother here.
I I understand the feeling behind that claim, but I don't accept the logic of the claim. That I don't agree that logically talking about it that way really diminishes it. But I understand something more social about how human beings interact and think about ourselves, that talking that way has an implication that isn't strictly logical.
Okay, we move on, and I can see that you can disengage our reality today as soon as we're through.
Well, no, because the words and deeds are part of the phenomenon of myself that goes forward.
And they're real.
They're real in that brains change with time, and how the brain experiences itself changes with time.
Okay.
Thanks, Fred. Please turn to page Roman numeral 12. I have to say, I think there's been fantastic improvement in the writing of this dissertation. Over the last few days, I went back through your first drafts that I received, and each of the intervening drafts, and all of the comments that I sent you. I have to also say, I think you've been impressively responsive to the comments that I've made in attempting to bring out your argument more clearly, and to avoid rough transitions and other problems along the way. So I have to compliment you, and I wrote that also in letters of recommendation. I think it's rare in our field that people hear criticisms and can respond to them in an intelligent way. And I can checked each one of them and saw exactly what you've done to each of the comments that I made along the way, or you ignored some. But by and large, but you attempted to address it, and I see immense improvement in the quality of the argument.
Thank you.
I've read all the drafts too.
Yeah. Did he do well in
Oh,
responding to comments?
absolutely, that's why I'm saying it, is because I thought the improvement was incredible.
Yeah.
I concur,
Unlike Fred and Pat, I'm beginning from the assumption of naturalism.
Mhm.
So I happen to be a theist, but for everything I'll say for the next 15 minutes presupposes naturalism, all right? So I'm completely sympathetic both with the methodological with the methodological naturalism of the dissertation and with the metaphysical naturalism that you allow yourself to place in a preface and a conclusion, but try to keep out of the pages as much as possible, except admitting it as you go along.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not going to push that naturalism nor praise it, but simply presuppose it in everything I say. I'd rather set your authors in dialogue with each other. So it's not you defending your position, it's defending the consistency of the appeals to the authors that you make. All right? So we begin on page 12. Remember, I'm a hardcore naturalist, right? I'm not, and you worry me a little bit. We're at the bottom of page 12. Hegel mystifies dialectic. Okay, we like the criticisms of Hegel. We've got Engels standing the dialectic on his head. He's right, then the dialectic exists in the structure of reality. I find that claim a little puzzling. Let me just add two more to it and then ask you to respond all at once. Okay, I'm reading this with the eyes of the person who arguably has the strongest single influence in the argument of dissertation, Daniel Dennett.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm Daniel Dennett, right? The dialectic exists in the structure of reality, page 15, Roman 15, middle of the page. Third and most classically, dialectics is the negation of the negation.
Mm-hmm.
Page 19, you're writing about dialectical materialism after Lenin's Infinity of Matter, focuses on changing You see 19, very middle of the page, among the different resulting from the interpenetration of oppositional tendencies and forces among the different structural levels as well as within the individual levels.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I get the brain-centric theory of the self. That just seems obviously right. I mean, that's obviously where cells are constructed out of. They're constructed out of functioning of a complex biological organ called the brain and central nervous system. But why in the same dissertation would this kind of language appear? Right? I mean, do you really want to assert this stuff? Why not talk about fundamental physical forces? Matter and energy, that's ultimately where brain structures come out of. And we can trace that line just as thoroughly or maybe more strictly than the material you cover in chapters 3 through 5 in the dissertation. So this is just poetry or something, right? I mean, when was this stuff done?
Well, well, that is why I put it in the preface, because you asked that question earlier on about including it at all. And in having it there at all, it's because there's groundwork there that I'm going forward with. And I think that having some conversation about the way that dialectics, and in particular dialectical materialism, talks about problems like the interpenetration of opposites, or how quantity can become quality, that those are useful theoretical insights for philosophy of mind. How does a quantity of brain cells become the quality of something that is conscious of itself? And that dialectics can talk about that in a way that straightforward analytic logic has a hard time talking about those things.
So that sounds like some sort of background methodological parameters or something?
Well, and very background, which is why it's in the
Right.
preface, yeah.
Okay, but I study the neural correlates of consciousness, and I'm interested in certain correlations that we have among, say, trained meditators in a lab where we're doing real-time fMRIs. And that's intriguing stuff. We have a
Yeah.
Tibetan monk meditating, going into a particular first-person state, as he might report it, and we can see what's happening in the brain. That's important data.
Yeah.
But are you telling me that that lab research is dependent on something as vague as dialectical, whatever it is? Dialectics existing in the structure of reality? Is there an epistemic dependence of my lab work on that stuff down here? In other words, do you build
No.
on Marx to get to
No.
brain research? So how is...
I built on Marx in order to speculate on the brain research.
Okay, so let's switch around. So this is fundamental, and then we're building upward, and somewhere up here in these lofty realms where I and Dandin and the rest of us are beginning to think language may be losing its traction.
Mm.
Somewhere up there, along with metaphysics and Hegel and God and stuff, is dialectical materialism.
Well,
That's not what you seem to be doing in this dissertation.
because I'm acknowledging that claiming that the structure of reality is material and dialectical is a kind of metaphysical claim. At least it's a claim that argues with what we usually call metaphysical claims.
So it is kind of up here, isn't it? It's a competing metaphysical hypothesis that we're going to try to evaluate based on some real science. As naturalists.
And we'll use to help to try and understand what the empirical results of the sciences discover about
Okay.
the world.
Do you see why I, Daniel Dennett, might be nervous about using this kind of lofty, vague, poetic stuff to interpret good, clean lab science? Do you see why for me as a naturalist, that might make me a little uncomfortable? The upward arrow
Yes.
is fine, head up anywhere you want, write poetry, but trying to dictate what I'm doing in the lab or interpret good, clear lab science with this kind of vague stuff, do you see why that might make me nervous?
Oh, yeah.
It's this downward arrow for metaphysics to interpret science. That do you really, as a naturalist,
Well,
do you really
I
want to
think-
go there?
Well, I think that I think that's an inherent problem in philosophy of science and how scientists understand their work and what people who do philosophy of science when they talk about what science does and how that impacts what scientists really do. I mean, there are places where philosophy, I think, can really inform how scientists think about problems.
But only as a heuristic, only sort of background framework stuff. But it's not dictating
Yes.
lab results, is it?
No.
Okay.
No, it's how to think about, well, what questions to ask in the lab, or how to think
Yeah, that's
about what do the
heuristics.
result, yes.
Okay.
It's, definitely not dictating
Okay, let me
lab
just
results.
let you chew on
No.
that worry. Do you feel why I, Dan Dennett, and others might be worried, and why we're going to want to urge great caution on you in this downward arrow from metaphysics to science? If you just see, it's enough that I can communicate.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I've got 6 more points and only
Okay.
8 more minutes. So now the next thing
Can
is.
I add a word for the existentialists again? Remember that they came up with the idea that truth is best expressed in art form, of which poetry is one.
Totally fine for me as a naturalist.
All right.
People can go do art anywhere. I mean, my key text that sadly you didn't pick up on it is E.O. Wilson's Concealments. Knowledge is what we can derive from scientific study of the natural world, and then poetry can be all over the place. Philosophy, religion, let them have it, you know, they can write that stuff. Just don't put the word knowledge over there. Keep it right down here with what we can test. So that voice is raised by your position, but not adequately dealt with. So, next point.
Okay.
Okay, that was something about the metaphysics. Now I want to ask about the naturalism itself, all right? And the first thought is, you're trying to help us understand the self, and you give us the frameworks of emotional, existential, and social aspects, right? And you go back as far as the brain and neuroscience in chapter 3, basically, and presupposed throughout. But why only to the brain? The brain's built, and it's built from a genetic code, the genome, right?
Yeah.
As manifested by a particular phenotype. So why do we stop with Dennett and not go to Dawkins? Why aren't you giving us the deeper explanatory account? We have good science of how brains are built. Why do you stop with brains? Or differently, isn't the implication of your position that they in turn could be explained by the science of neurological development, namely developmental neurobiology? Isn't that the more fundamental field, really, developmental neurobiology, genetically based neurobiology?
Well, probably it is.
I'm so glad you said that.
My interest is cultural. So at some point it's a matter of where, at what level is the scientific speculation useful to questions that are cultural in nature.
Okay, now, see, I don't like the word scientific speculation. Scientific
Well,
knowledge and philosophical speculation.
But I'm relying on people, on neuroscientists who are speculating about their research.
So in the next 2 minutes, I want to see how far the knowledge actually goes back. Because in science, we have dependence relationships. Neuroanatomy is a product of neurophysiological development, which is a product of gene coding,
Yeah.
the genome. So that's right? We should go to there.
Yeah.
So in a sense, I could say the fundamental level is genetic. I mean, genes are the basis of evolution, natural selection. And then you happen to be interested in a particular byproduct of
Yes.
the genome, which is the brain, and then its byproducts, which is
Yes.
culture. Okay, so really, you should have said the gene. I mean, if we're following the logical implications down, the real naturalistic implications down to where the source is.
Well, at least I could have.
No, I'm asking the knowledge claim.
I'm not
a
so
scientist.
should. Well,
But I'm looking at following the explanatory arrow downward.
Right.
And you've got brains, and I'm just making sure that you're agreeing that brains go down to genes. And the explanation of brain, so that's the reduction in terms of being, and then this is the explanation. All explanatory arrows move from an existing phenomenon downwards, says Stephen Weinberg, to genes.
mhm.
Okay, so, I mean, that's a straightforward biological claim, so there's no problem with us there, is there?
No.
Okay, genes aren't an ultimate, of course. In origins of life research, we were able to understand development of the genome in terms of biochemistry, right? So really, I mean, I just came from a conference with Dave Deemer, who does origins of life. He says, we're this close to accounting for the development of the first self-reproducing cell. He said, there's 6 steps involved, and I've done 2 in the lab, and we're just about to do the 3rd. So and the next, we know how to do the next 2.
Mhm.
So really, for me as a scientific explainer, this would be the more fundamental level, right?
Well,
And again, you might choose to focus on genes, but you
Right.
understand it's a biochemical product involved in a certain interesting dynamic in the natural world, which then produces a particular interesting structure, the brain, which then produces culture, where you're interested by it.
right.
But in terms of ontology, I mean, what is real?
Yeah.
What is the explanatory base of everything? It's here, and then of course you know that I'm going to do the rest. So it's really physics, right?
Yes.
So the metaphysics that you offer is really Stephen Weinberg, maybe, is the Dreams of the Final Theory.
Actually, I'm not familiar with it.
Anyway, core physical explanation, which
Mhm.
then over the course of evolution, cosmic evolution, produces these different levels.
Right. And that's where I think the metaphysics comes in at both levels. I mean, at some point, the metaphysical claims of dialectical materialism have to do with suggesting that when physicists talk about patterns in the world, that those patterns are analyzable in ways that philosophy is comfortable with. That
Yeah.
this word
Yeah, I understand
dialectic,
how
this word
philosophy gets in there.
dialectic.
So really the truth is that, though you never use the word in the dissertation, I don't think, that you're a physicalist. We say naturalist.
Yes.
But because this is how science works, it's really physicalist. Fundamental physics is the core explanatory unit. And what exists are physical particles and energies.
Yes.
And then they take forms.
Which have, yes, patterns of action
Okay.
at different levels of complexity.
Okay. I pushed you a lot on how emergence works in complex systems. And I thought clarity emerged in the final draft, and even in today's discussion, which I was intriguing. I want to ask you if this is your view. Let's just start with the gene for a moment. All right. No, let's leave that. Let's start with your level, the brain. If it isn't the case that we have emerging out of that in an ongoing process, various levels, and whether chapters 3, 4, and 5 aren't sort of in a hierarchical process of production or natural emergence, so that the first is something like the emotional life, for the sort of reasons that Masio gives us.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, we have what you call the existential level, or the emergence of a self. And then we have a social dimension, which brings with it the emergence of morality, right? And then we have, there's a lot up here, but in particular religion and philosophy, right? And then we have this ongoing process of emergence where something new emerges and can be understood and analyzed in the language of Camus or Dewey or
Right.
or Gandhi, right, or these people, but you're a naturalist because the story is traced back down to what it depends on, which is neuroscience.
I think the difference between the way that you look at it and the way that I look at it is, that if I understand the little bit of your work that I'm familiar with, is that those different levels, and in using the word emergent, you're implying that there is a new ontological reality that has
Excellent.
emerged.
Good. But
And-
okay, there are 3 positions that there. I think I want to find out which of 2 you hold. You clearly don't hold the strong emergence view.
Right.
But I want to ask if chapters 3, 4, and 5 exist like expanding shells in this sense. You don't actually say that in the dissertation, but as I reread it, it seemed to me there is a sort of expanding nature, 3 moving out to chapter 4, moving out to chapter 5. Moving out really, then finally to those broader questions. Is that a fair, does that match your conception? Again, I haven't said they really emerge and they're really real, but just, is there a hierarchical arrangement of chapters 3, 4, and 5? Successive products.
I want to say no.
Oh, okay.
In that the evolution of the human brain in its capacities to do these things, that all 3 of these are interrelated and coincident in time, so that they're not dependent on one another in the way that you're visually representing it. Now, certainly the fact of the brain using emotions in certain ways, and that going back in our evolutionary past to animals that didn't have the complex social structures that we have. That I can see how that implies a kind of hierarchy.
And of course, it's not value or whatever.
Genetic.
No, it's just,
hierarchy.
it's an evolutionary history. I mean, first you have the emergence of nerve cells, right? And then you have collections of nerve cells, the sort of proto-brain. So we have our old brain and you know, limbic system, and then much later in evolution of the differentiated frontal cortex. So wouldn't that kind of, this is how it happened factually, lead to a sort of nesting of these dimensions in their emergence?
In a sense, although I think actually the social has to come before the existential.
Okay. Anyway, wouldn't
Evolutionary speaking.
Would that evolutionary arrow allow you to say some things about the interrelationships between the phenomena you discuss in chapters 3, 4, and 5? In terms of the order in which they emerge and what depends on what in the evolutionary process?
Oh, I think there is something to be said about that.
Okay. So I think there are some inconsistencies in the dissertation that stands because you haven't thought through your own evolutionary naturalism carefully enough, and that a clearer, cleaner, crisper story of their interdependence and their emergence, one building on the other, could be told.
Well, I'm not sure that I accept that as a critique. I certainly accept it as an observation of where additional work could be done.
Yeah, good. And would be implied by your starting point. Okay, I think I have time only for one last question. What shall I single out here? I was going to ask you about, obviously it's not strong emergence. The weak emergence is to say that there are these other products, but they don't take on their own reality. They're sort of phenomena, and that's kind of what I heard you answer to the earlier questions, that we see emerging at certain points. We can analyze them in terms of their own levels of explanation, but the causal arrows still go down finally. So I think weak emergence is one where I wasn't, turn to page 10. I wasn't sure whether you really wanted to endorse that. Real 10.
10, okay.
Yeah. There's a tension between what I think is that your position, I call it weak emergence, these phenomena emerge, and the dialectic language, because dialectics is not identical. Look in the very middle of page 10. Here again, the language is convoluted, because the same organ that creates culture, the brain, biologically speaking, is a product of culture, brain having form mind. This is Pat's circle worry. This is a dialectical process in which the cause and effect mutually interpenetrate one another. That mutual interpenetration, or sort of equality of the levels, say these and this, makes us naturalists, scientific naturalists, uncomfortable.
Well,
So, I mean, if you took the weak emergence and the dialectic was somehow up there, you'd be closer to existing science.
I think I'm closer maybe than you're seeing it, and maybe it's just because the word dialectical is getting in the way. The account that I'm giving here is derived straight from Geertz and the way that Geertz talks about the development of culture and the formation of mind, and his argument that those are parallel processes that mutually interpenetrate each other, and that as culture develops, brains develop complexity, and as brains develop complexity, culture develops complexity, and so you have the two of them that form together historically in the history of the species.
Excellent. I think the dissertation goes back and forth between emergent, weak emergentist language, and the coevolution thesis that we associate with William Durham. I sent you that reference on one of the letters back. In future publications, I think I would try to look more carefully at the evolution of brain and culture. Durham formulated in the early 1990s, and Terry Deacon wrote a brilliant book on coevolution in 1997 called The Symbolic Species, How the Development of Brain and Culture Mutually Influence Each Other. And he holds a position, I just came from a 4-day conference with him, position similar to yours. That latter one, coevolution, would let you keep the dialectic language. The standard, the Dennett picture of weak emergence is in tension with it. So I see two paradigms of evolutionary naturalism at work in the thesis, and you have to bring them into dialogue with each other. I think you're more happy in the end because of the Marxist side with the coevolution. I'm out of time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, it was fun.
Thank you. Ladies, gentlemen, all gentlemen mostly, except I think your wife has to say in this.
Oh.
Really?
Do we have more questions, or what are we ready to do?
Yeah, I had, you're asking the audience
The
for
audience.
questions?
Well, yes, we'll see how much we have
Okay.
time for, but I thought we'd done very well, but I think we have a little time for some extra questions. Well, I meant
well,
us
it's
too,
only,
is
yeah,
that's what you
well, it's only
meant.
11.
Oh, yes, no, we have some time.
Sure, there's lots more to say.
Yeah, I've got nothing to say.
But you haven't had your 15 minutes first, so maybe we should.
Oh, I've had my time up to date.
I actually
so
have a-
many drafts.
I'm sorry, I have a question if I may.
Please.
Have you had a chance to look at anything from biosocial anthropology or, it goes under a number of names, but people like Dawkins, John Tooby, they do a lot of interesting work on relating evolution to culture. And I've heard some interesting criticisms of the work, but I think that could be a place to look too. Like Clayton said, that that's if you want to take it back a step from brains and go to genes and relate that to culture, there's a lot of work being done on that.
And I'm vaguely aware of it, and I'm vaguely aware that it's highly controversial.
Yeah.
So that's the reason for not getting into it. The formal reason for not getting into it is that going down that next level and asking about deeper causes, that there's a whole lot of controversy in there that
I've heard that.
that I wasn't prepared to take an informed stand on, because my interest is a couple levels up.
Okay.
But it clearly is something interesting for the future that I'll want to become more familiar with.
Do I go first, Pat, or
Sure, let me, on page 122, your discussion of Durkheim and Philip's criticism of Durkheim. You seem to want to hold the position that it's possible that the referent has an independent truth. That is, it's the discussion of religious believers having a true referent independent of us, right? And you seem to want to hold the position that it's possible, but I don't see how you can hold this position if you are the thoroughgoing naturalist that you are. How would you explain the possibility, that sort of possibility, given that, and this is basically Philip's point about Durkheim, right, is that, or any of the so-called reductionists, supreme examples of reductionism, that what counts as real, in your in your discussion earlier, what will count as real? How could it be possible for there to be this independent referent?
Well,
because it's
right.
if you take the believer seriously, that it's that God is spirit, for example, and not a physical entity, or a certain kind of believer who makes that sort of claim.
Right. Well, and to be clear, so far we've had kind of two different sorts of conversations, because there's the one conversation that has to do with where the preface and the conclusion tie together in more ultimate claims that about how I look at the world, and in the body then there is my more intentionally neutral stance on those questions. So I'm not prepared to offer an explanation for how that might be possible. I'm just saying that for the sake of my argument about selves needing cultural material, that believers of various sorts might assert that there is some higher reality that is participating in that process in ways that I don't understand and are not obvious from the discussion, from the material that I've used to discuss this. But that's not to say that it's impossible. So I'm acknowledging the possibility that there could be other forms of intervention, other forms in other things influencing the formation of culture.
But in order for it to be real and true, of course, on your view, it would have to be something physical, right? I mean,
well,
that what is independent of the believer would have to be something physical, right?
Not for my core argument. But I think for the core argument, I'm trying to tread a fine line in which I'm accepting the possibility that while I'm giving a naturalistic account, that there are supernaturalist accounts that could be added onto it. But I am going to insist that those supernatural accounts are not in a position to supersede the naturalistic account. They can supplement it, but could not replace it.
But I mean, is the natural account, so that you seem to want to hold a position that a thoroughgoing naturalist does not necessarily contradict a supernatural account.
Well, on this specific question,
a thoroughgoing methodological naturalist doesn't necessarily deny the possibility of
Okay.
that it is possible that when the Aborigines, Durkheim's Aboriginal Australians, when they talk about influences from their gods, that while Durkheim dismisses them, for my purposes, there's an argument that Durkheim makes that's very important for understanding the formation of selves, in which I can take the more neutral stance and say, well, maybe Phillips has a point, and that Durkheim is speaking, sort of is overreaching his evidence in dismissing these things. And that's okay, because I'm trying to present the argument in a way that is comfortable to people who are going to approach it from both methodological points of view.
Yeah,
within certain limits.
I mean, I think Philip's point is that the methodology itself, I mean, that you can't sort of separate your methodology off from what your assumptions are about the nature of reality, so that that you can't that it's difficult to see. It's difficult to see the sense of that. That is how it's possible. So that for someone who is a thoroughgoing naturalist, when they say, "I'm going to bracket this question," it doesn't mean that they can't make observations like sociological connections and that sort of thing. But bracketing the question just means I'm not going to deal with it, because it's very clear from your methodology that you don't think that it can be true, that it's not possible for it to be true.
Yeah, right. I personally don't, but that personal position is the argument in the core of the dissertation doesn't depend on that personal position of mine. And I think that the way I'm handling it is comparable to the way that Ramachandran handles it. That he talks about the fact that people have these religious experiences, and while he as a scientist can talk about everything that seems to account for it in a naturalistic way, he's not prepared to say that naturalistic account necessarily precludes there being some element of truth in how the believer talks about it. And I think that's, so in bracketing that question from the argument, I'm allowing for there to be other factors, even though the factors that I'm bringing up are sufficient to account for the phenomenon. They don't logically preclude additional factors.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's somewhat related to what Phil was saying earlier, and I appreciate his discussion, particularly taking the position of Dennett, although it might have been more appropriate to have been like Dennett's supreme student or something like that, like his primary graduate student or something. But anyway,
I can't claim equality with the master.
No, you quote about your quote about Augustine, I think brings us out, and I get this
From
is
the
where,
preface?
yeah, from the preface. This is where I'm, this is where I'm struggling. I mean, you're very clear about the fact that there are these things that you believe in that you can't prove, and you don't expect that you could make an argument that would be a sort of knockdown proof of these beliefs that you have. And yet, of course, you talk a lot about science and evidence from science and all of that, and that it's that evidence plays some sort of role or has some sort of relation to those beliefs, which is fine. But my final question has to do with this, with the idea that human beings naturally tend towards egalitarianism, and
Okay, the conclusion.
Yeah, in the conclusion.
Uh-huh.
And my question is, I can make a lot of sense out of that belief. I can make a lot of sense out of that as a belief. That is, that someone hopes and believes in this sort of thing, and perhaps strong theological accounts of a God in whom we can hope. But my question is, how dependent is your view of this tendency? How dependent is it upon scientific evidence? Because it sounds like at times, it sounds like at times that this is an aspect of your argument that you could easily prove scientifically, that human beings are clearly have a tendency toward egalitarianism. And my question is, I mean, is that the case? Because then it looks as if I could bring in all kinds of evidence to show, of course, human beings are not egalitarian, all kinds of examples where they don't demonstrate this. So to what extent is that claim at the end, to what extent is it dependent upon scientific evidence, or to what extent is it just something that you firmly believe and have a conviction about?
It's weakly associated with the scientific evidence.
Okay.
And I think in particular the way that people like Shore and Siegel talk about the necessity for interpersonal relationships and that the quality of those relationships have an important role in mental health, that provides some level of, you know, empirical support for what I'm claiming is a natural tendency that history does not actualize very well at present. So
History does not actualize.
well, in the history seems to be largely a history of people not treating each other equally. And so even though you know these developmental psychologists can present an argument about why it is that the human brains need certain kinds of relationships and benefit from certain kinds of relationships, the fact of history does not show that we live that out.
But as a Marxist, I mean, shouldn't your position be that in fact human beings are not egalitarian, do not naturally tend toward egalitarianism, if in fact history bears out that they're not?
Well, my claim is that and from previous conversations, I know that you don't accept this claim, but my claim is that history actually shows that we're making progress in that direction.
I thought you just said that history shows that we're not.
I'm saying history has shown we haven't done very well yet at actualizing what this apparent,
Okay.
psychological need or latent potential. But I think that the history does show that there is a positive tendency there, that we are getting better at it over time.
And how would you treat the example of some nut who figures out a way to extinguish the human race? I mean, the nut is a human being, so how would you? I mean, I think clearly you want to say, well, that's a kind of anomaly, or I don't know, but how would you account for something like that?
Well, lots of things can interfere with the tendency, and that's the point I try to make about the difference between making a teleological argument and making an argument about a tendency.
Right. Okay.
Tending in this direction, but all kinds of things get in the way.
Right. So when you say
and can.
Yeah, when you say a tendency, what's strange about calling it a tendency, I guess, is that there are any number of things that you seem willing to admit that could cause things to tend the other direction.
Right. I suppose my point is that I'm arguing that this is a macro tendency, and that in shorter term views, one can see counter tendencies that overwhelm that, but that in sort of the big picture of the evolution of the species, that there is this identifiable tendency, which could be cut short through a nuclear holocaust, or through the extinction of the species from global warming too.
But in what sense can it be a macro tendency if it can be eliminated by one act?
Well,
I mean, in what sense, why can't I say, well, there is this macro tendency in the human race, which is that we've developed this ability to destroy ourselves, and as a part of this tendency, it seems rather natural to me that we will in fact end up destroying ourselves, because that is in fact what we're tending toward. What from your argument keeps me from offering an exactly opposite macro tendency?
I think it's a different kind of argument in which you may be just as correct as I am. The tendency that I'm talking about has to do with our biology, and the tendency that you're talking about has to do with the vagaries of how technology has developed and how we're using that technology in particular phases of our biological evolution.
Yeah, but even though you say it's rooted in biology, which I see, certainly the claim that you make is not a biological claim. The claim that you make is that we will, what's the term? Oh, I remember now. You put it at the end of the preface, I think. At the end of the preface, the terms you use are not biological.
Tending towards mutually supportive
Yeah,
egalitarian
that's it.
relationships.
Is that the preface or I think the preface or the introduction? Anyway, tendency toward
The
mutually supportive, and what's the other phrase?
egalitarian.
Yeah.
Using, and Siegel in particular would be the major source for that argument, at least to date, for me to date, that's what brains need to function well. Other things get in the way of brains functioning well. So the tendency has this biological foundation, but that tendency is not determinative of our history. It kind of nudges us in certain directions. Other things nudge or pull in competing directions.
But then, of course, I mean, on your argument, of course, all of the developments which lead up to the possibility of a Holocaust are themselves rooted in biology as well. Isn't that correct? I mean, the fact that we have, it's not just that a nut shows up. There's also this history of the human being who has developed this situation in which a nut can show up and do something like that. So that process is also rooted in biology, on your view. So I guess what I'm saying, that's why I'm saying that this tendency, you talk about a tendency, a biological tendency. Well, all of the actions, on your view, of human beings, all actions, on your view, are biologically rooted. So then any story of either good or evil in humankind, on your view, is rooted in biology. So it still doesn't seem clear to me how I can't, on your view, offer a macro tendency, which is our biological selves have developed in such a way that they tend toward mutual destruction. Because it's our biological brains that brought us to this point. It's our biological brains that
Because I don't think that's the pattern that one sees in history. I think one can identify events that occur that dramatize what you're talking about, but this point, I come back to Whitehead's argument, that there's something very important about the fact that when Plato was writing, people universally accepted the idea that some people should own other people, and that today we universally reject the idea that some people should own other people. But I see that as evidence of a significant improvement in the species.
Can I jump in at that point? So I was actually looking at a similar area, the passage on page 121. So maybe we could look at that. That's page 121 is where you say, I believe there is an objective morality, which is kind of a stalking claim for naturalist community. And you actually use the phrase in a sense 3 times because you're a little unsure what to say. Objective morality, in a sense, grounded in empathy.
Yeah.
How this empathy is acted out varies, and so calling objective can be confusing. But as it is grounded, right? So you add the ed. In our biology, it is objective in a sense. I found that in a sense it comes back on page 135. You're talking about biologically determined propensities toward love, just below the quote, the Siegel quote on 135. Love is a biologically determined propensity. I think determined is too strong for your own view. Either way, 4 lines further down, it is objectively better for these relationships to be caring and mutually supportive, to be just, in some sense, right? So it seems to me that, see if this is right, that in interstate, you actually get to argue 2 ways in support of those views, which I think are consistent. I don't have problems with either. And it's consistent for you to argue in both ways, right? And the one is to find direct relationships between our neurophysiology and our broader social tendencies. So you appeal to Franz de Waal's work with primates in his famous book, Good Natured, and he says certain tendencies for reconciling behavior and so forth we see manifested in other primates. And here are biological reasons why we're going to find that. And it has evolutionary value. So there can be a kind of direct argument for the grounding from the biology into the social behaviors.
Right.
But what you said in arguing with Pat, it's also consistent for you to notice tendencies up here, which one can only see at this level of abstraction, broader historical tendencies. So what the tendency of cultural movement from Plato to the present, right? And you don't have to ground every step of that movement downward, of course, this is where it's grounded, but you also can see, as you say, patterns emerging here. You can see patterns in the social world, patterns in the existential, patterns in the emotional, which can be discussed empirically, as it were, at that level of abstraction. So there are 2 kinds of arguments. The one is this correlation, and the one is this diachronic correlation to definitive view. That would be it, right?
Well, yes. I think that what Siegel says about mindsight in particular and the implications that has for a more sophisticated understanding of de Waal's work are the brain level argument that people have an objective interest in in certain kinds of relationships, and we call that objective interest mental health in a modern terminology. It's a further argument to say that if we look at our actual history, that we can see that we've been making progress in that direction. So I think that there are different points that support each other.
But consistent to arguing both
Yeah.
ways. Okay, my last question is understanding the status of that upper stuff. And is this what our discussion today has led to? It's led to the willingness, the importance of speaking of them as real. So there really are existential features to human existence. There really are social dimensions. There really are broader historical patterns. But they are derivatively real.
Yeah.
Namely, they're products of the natural core. So somebody might say, well, if they're derivatively real, then you're undercutting or devaluing the person or the history or something.
Right.
But you're saying, no, they're derivative and they're real. We value them for what they are, namely derivative realities, products. Culture as a whole is a product of biology, right? Derivatively real, yet still real.
Right.
That
No.
seems to be what we've come to.
But
that's not a criticism, by the way.
no, I
It's a
know.
widely held position.
But there's a, I think, a complicated argument to be had between the strong emergent and the weak emergent and what distinguishes those things. And even though, and I'm comfortable with all of the words that you're using, I'm aware that you're using them in a way that is implying real in a stronger way than the way that I want to.
No, that's external. That's my own view, and
Okay.
I have other reasons for thinking I'm right on that. But within the context of your view, it would be what I'd call weakly emergent. Namely, they're phenomena that emerge out of
Yeah.
these basal systems and that have interesting interactions at that level of emergence. But they don't become, they aren't real selves in the sense of strong emergence or downward causation of mentality or something.
Right.
Actually, it'd be fun to explore how minimalist your view of emergence is, but we don't have time. I guess I wanted to say, then on page 121, that would help clean up this language, wouldn't it? Because if we would say real but derivatively real,
Yeah.
that's our core thesis. A 4-word T-shirt phrase to summarize the position. Then you can clean this up, right? Because I believe there's an objective morality, that is, moral relations are real. Yet, of course, they're derivative. They're grounded in the biological phenomenon of empathy, right? that as it's grounded in our biology, it's real, but it's derivative because it's a product of those biological systems. So actually, you have some fairly clean and I think consistent things to say there. I'd love to do the marks, but I think probably we should.
Well, I just want to say, I think our discussions have been perfect. Are there any other questions we need to bring up before we move to the next phase?
I just want to caution you against embracing Phil's account here, because it does, I mean, you made a very strong statement at the beginning that the self is not real. And now it seems that, that we're close to accepting real but derivatively real. So I would just say be very clear about, about that distinction, and further just say that you do seem to me, and I think this is what Phil is getting at, is that for your argument and the conclusions that you draw and the things that you want to claim do seem to rely very heavily upon recognizing patterns in these other areas. And that does seem to get you very close. I mean, it's just extremely difficult to hold that position that these patterns, like broader historical tendencies, making an argument on the basis of broader historical tendencies, would be very difficult to do so without saying that they're real in some way, you know. I mean,
But
that's how.
He says that on 158,
I know,
the language is clear. That on bottom 157, you say the self qua consciousness needs recognition. That might need to be cleaned up to say the pattern, emergent pattern of consciousness, we need to recognize it as a pattern. So it's not that you actually are defining the self qua consciousness. So that phrase would need cleaning up on the bottom of 157. But on 158 in the middle, do you see the very middle of 158? 4 lines down in the middle paragraph. As I present the speculation, this history of the self, it's the history of actual selves existing over time. It has the appearance of a teleology that leads to mutually supportive. What seems like a teleology is, however, only apparent. In the same way, natural evolution has what looks like but isn't really teleology. And on the first line of 159, second line of 159, the complexity that we see in primates appears as if the development had some sort of intention. So you stay consistent with the basal level. If there isn't intention down here, there isn't ultimately intention. But there are definitely patterns which appear they call it teleonomy in biological theory.
Okay.
It's not real teleology, it's teleonomy.
And part of the difficulty is that in these realms, there are concepts or ideas that are operative that you seem to want to admit when you say something like you're not saying that morality is not real. I mean, you're not saying that morality is not real. The difficulty is, how do you hold on to the concepts there, and at the same time say that, well, they're derivative from the brain, but of course, even if you were able to show exactly and precisely the way in which they're derivative from the brain, they don't actually play out that way in society. That is, when going back to your example of the red page, when we discuss red objects in the room, we don't make references to light and light refraction. So then that seems, it seems that it puts you in a difficult position of having to say that when someone makes a moral claim, there's a really real account of that can be traced back to, theoretically, perhaps hasn't been done yet, but can be traced back to the brain, and that the moral claim itself is not what is really real. And I mean, that could put you in on some difficult positions with regard to conditions of evil and circumstances of evil, I think. So I guess I would offer that last caution. I mean, I know you well enough to know that you don't want to be in a position of saying, diminishing someone's experience of evil.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that this emphasis upon the really real being rooted in the brain might have a tendency to diminish the experience of evil in a way that I don't think you would want to do. I don't know, but I mean, I feel fairly confident that you wouldn't want to do that. So, for example, a moral claim, like people shouldn't torture other people, or even animals. People shouldn't do that. Your position makes it look as if what is really real would be, being able to trace it back to how that moral position evolved from the brain or emerged from the brain. And the person in that situation would tend to want to say, no, what's really wrong is that someone is being tortured. And
Yeah.
so I would just say be cautious, because
Right.
I know that's not what you want to do, but be cautious, particularly when you're talking about evil and good and suffering and those kinds of issues.
Admittedly, the language is complex to me. To be precise without denigrating the significance of moral claims
Right.
in the world.
Right.
I understand that point.
Thank you. I think the questions have gone very, very well. Now the committee needs to meet. And we thank all of our guests for coming and participating.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Not in this case?
No, and in this case also. And I just wanted to comment on three features of the process as a whole, since I came into it, that I think reflect well on you and your future as a scholar. The first one is the one I mentioned before, to be able to take a document that has weaknesses and get to make it better, and massively better each time around. And one might think that there was just a certain period and then it would stop getting better, but every interaction, at least we had, and my colleagues have said the same thing behind your back, the result was better and better and better. And I don't know a lot of students who have the capacity, and professors, it's virtually never happened. Have the capacity to do that.
So I can give it up now?
It's logically impossible.
We were dealing with a lot of professors with very clear opinions.
Yeah,
so.
right. Yeah, and a second strength that I saw was the ability to substantiate arguments by appeals to a literature. And I have reasons having to do with scientific rationality. I think it's important to have a group of scholars who are supporting of you, and that you can allude to that group of scholars and use all their work as ways to substantiate the particular things you want to say. And looking back at my oldest comments, my first letters,
That was
to
your-
you,
yeah, that was
that
your
was a
first comment.
panic. And now I see, of course you could go deeper, of course there's more to read, but it's as if you seem grounded in the kinds of discussions, and you have at least a few representatives of each of the major discussions. You know what your allies are, and that to me adds to the rationality. And the third thing that makes me perhaps most pleased of all is that in dealing with the criticisms of the academic community who are trying to make you say the thesis more strongly, you were able to defend the position you wanted to defend. You handed us first what I inherited, I guess, from Ansel Min, was this thing that you wanted to say, right? And that didn't have to be thrown away. It's still there. It's in the preface and its conclusion, but the intermediate part, the dissertation proper, is for me, crucial step to get to the position you finally want to get to. And that is just a beautiful symbol of how academic works at its best. We take a position, we nuance it, it undergoes certain changes in the process, right? But the outcome is a better argued, more defensible case for this vision or sense of how things fit together, which is that of the individual scholar, in this case yours. And it was fun to see that you didn't have to, that you could be, to thine own self be true, is the old expression. And you were able to do that. At the same time, you were able to raise the standards of argumentation in the process.
Nicely put, thank you.
Thank you. And a lot of it actually is Pat's work, because we had a couple of long phone conversations between different drafts, and the way the inner core changed, the way the argument changed, is what was a lot to do with Pat and Pat asking more and more precise questions, and that forced me to put it in more and more precise terms. So I really have to thank Pat for the way he
Well,
pushed.
I just want to concur with what Phil has said. Quite frankly, I didn't think that you could get to this point at my initial reading. And what has been extraordinary is, what's been extraordinary for me, I suppose, and I concur with Phil that in all this you've been able to defend your own position, but what has been extraordinary for me in working with you is that I feel like that you actually listened to what I was saying. You know, I mean and that is all the more extraordinary given how far apart we are philosophically. Yeah. And I'll say this, that if you continue to do that, I mean, if you can continue to actually listen to what your opponents and your critics are saying, I mean, really hear what they're saying, you've got an extraordinary career ahead of you. And
That's strong words.
Yeah, it is, and I find myself surprised to be saying them to you because of our differences. But I firmly believe that, really do. So congratulations.
Called
on
earned
that.
respect, right?
Yeah, earned respect. Absolutely, and that's the most valuable, I think.
And that's exactly what I saw, and that the differences were very extreme.
Yes.
Had to do something about it, and he did it, and he did a good job.
I think that's
He
the
can
beauty of
improve,
dialectics.
you
Yeah,
understand?
there you go.
He can improve.
You deserve to get the last
It's
word
the
on that one.
negation of something.
Negation of negation.
Yeah.
So,
Well
yeah,
done, I think
very
you
good.
really had a good showing today too. I mean, in the last minute, I think you handled some very well thought out criticism. And maybe didn't convince everybody in the room about everything, but certainly came off looking very good. So congratulations on that.
Thanks.
Richard Sy.